Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Hannah Dennis, and I'm a research assistant in the defense program here at CNAS. Joining me today, I have Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, the director of the defense program at CNAS, and she's also my boss and the co-writer for the report that we're going to discuss today. We also have our two esteemed guests, Dr. Phil Saunders and Mr. John Warden. Phil works at the National Defense University, where he is the director for the Institute for National Strategic Studies, Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. And John comes to us from the Institute for Defense Analysis, where he is a researcher in the Strategy, Forces, and Resource Division. And John previously served on the House Armed Services Committee professional staff, where he provided critical insight as an advisor on the nuclear weapons portfolio. So between our three panelists, I think we've gathered some excellent expertise on China military affairs and nuclear posture. So today's discussion stems from research that Stacie and I conducted over the last year on challenges for nuclear escalation management in a war with China. As part of that research, we conducted two tabletop exercises, or TTXs, looking at a Taiwan invasion contingency. And our goal was to sort of explore potential triggers and thresholds and targets for Chinese nuclear use, as well as our options as the United States for preventing and managing intra-war escalation. And all of that research culminated in our recently released report right here. And it would not have been possible without the support of our sponsor, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So we'd like to thank them. Before we get into the discussion, I need to run through a couple administrative notes. This conversation is public and it will be recorded. It's being live streamed, and we'll post the video after the event concludes. You also have the opportunity to join the conversation. I'm going to reserve some time at the end to take your questions, and you can submit them throughout the event, either on cnas.org/live, just scroll down to under the video, or you can tweet a question with the hashtag CNAS2023. When you do ask a question, please identify yourself because we don't take any anonymous questions. So with that, I would love to begin our discussion by turning to Stacie. Stacie, this report followed on from research that you conducted in 2022 that argued that we had entered a multipolar nuclear era. Can you describe the new context that we find ourselves in and what factors precipitated this global shift?
Thanks, Hannah. And thanks to John and Phil for being here. I'm really excited for this discussion that we're going to have. I couldn't imagine two folks with more expertise on these issues to really explore this. So Jenny Matuszak and I had written a report, Long Shadows, which was really just surveying the shifting nuclear landscape. And it is changing in ways that are individually small, but I think cumulatively very different and underappreciated. And sadly, it's not just back to the future in terms of nuclear weapons are becoming more important. We're entering some sort of brave new world because so many different states now have nuclear weapons. And in particular, China's nuclear arsenal is being expanded and operationalized in a way that it never was before, which means that the United States faces two great power competitors, Russia and China, who both have significant conventional military might and robust nuclear arsenals. And while China's been a nuclear armed state for a long time, which I'm sure Phil will tell us more about, it really had a very different posture that was almost aberrant. And it seems to have abandoned that. So we went through this period at the end of the Cold War, wherein the US defense community, there was a movement to try to diminish the role of nuclear weapons in US strategy and globally to reduce the risks of nuclear war, which is a very laudable goal and something that we would all want to achieve. But I think that many American policymakers were a little bit naive and assume that everyone was going to follow suit and do what the United States was doing, and that only a couple of rogue nations like North Korea, maybe Iran, might be willing to buck this trend and actually develop and expand their nuclear capabilities or pursue nuclear weapons. And that proved not to be true. And part of this is associated with and coinciding with the dissolution of the arms control regime, which really started to unravel when the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And then there were later revelations that Russia had been violating the INF agreement by developing some missiles that superseded the prohibitive range. And then the United States eventually withdrew from that. And you've seen that this arms control regime, which really capped competition at the nuclear era, has frayed. And Russia recently announced that it was suspending implementation of New START, which has capped the strategic arsenals of Russia and the United States. And then you throw in China. And a few years ago, the report on Chinese military power that the Defense Department issues to Congress really sort of dropped a bombshell in terms of saying that China was trying to dramatically expand the size of its nuclear arsenal. And this had been prompted in part by open source intelligence and analysis that had been done by folks in a couple of different locations that had identified new intercontinental ballistic missile silo fields that were being built by China, and really sort of suggested that things were starting to change. And so you have all of these trends that are coinciding and leading us into this future that I think is uncharted and that is going to require the United States to think differently about nuclear weapons and to sort of revitalize its thinking about nuclear deterrence and really grapple with the issues of trying to deter two nuclear great powers and lesser states like North Korea, which is clearly, with its recent test of its ICBM that now is solid fueled, clearly not going to give up its nuclear weapons. So that's a fairly bleak picture, but it is a really important sort of context, and I think an issue that the U.S. needs to spend some time developing the right policy responses to.
Thank you. John, if there's anything you want to add just to build on Stacie's comments about the historical context, I think that would be super helpful. Could you also kind of tell us what makes today's challenge unique?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Stacie did a pretty good job of summarizing what the situation is. You know, the United States has dealt with a formidable nuclear power before. The Soviet Union obviously had a very expansive nuclear capability. China has had nuclear weapons since the 1960s. And more recently, for the last decade, the United States has dealt with 3 nuclear armed adversaries in China, Russia, and North Korea. But this challenge is unique in the sense of what we face today, but even more so the trajectory of where China is going on, in that the United States is likely to face 2 near-peer nuclear-armed adversaries, Russia and China, with arsenals that are likely to be comparable in size and sophistication to the U.S. And in addition to that growth and capabilities, the additional factor is that we also have to worry, or at least monitor, the potential that Russia and China could be more aligned. So if you combine that growth in size, but also that potential for alignment, it creates a unique challenge, I think, for the United States. And one other thing that I'll highlight, just to build on what Stacie said, is that obviously the China numbers, the top line numbers that are projected are what grabs the headlines. But there's also the fact that they're really diversifying the types of nuclear forces that they're pursuing in terms of, and I'm sure Phil will talk in more detail about this, but that also kind of indicates some change in at least the type of capabilities that they have to have more options for things like theater nuclear strikes. And that could portend changes coming down the line in terms of how they're thinking about their strategy and when they might think about using nuclear weapons if there is a future conflict.
That's great. Let's dive a little deeper into how the arsenal is changing and what indications that could give us about the future. That's something that our red team in both games spent a lot of time thinking about. So I'm going to shift to Phil, our China hand for today, with a few questions. First, Phil, as we look for indications in a shift in nuclear policy, could you dive a little deeper into the role nuclear weapons have played historically in China's strategy? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Phil, I think you're muted.
Oh, Phil, can you hear us? I think you might be muted.
Gotcha. So I have to give my disclaimer, which John probably gave for me. These are my views, not DoD or NDU or US government views. Historically, China's nuclear deterrent has mainly been about deterring nuclear threats and deterring a strategic nuclear first strike. A little bit of prestige, because being part of the nuclear club demonstrated a certain degree of scientific and technological agreement. But I think the point is it's been limited to a fairly limited purpose for nuclear weapons, and they've been satisfied historically with a fairly small nuclear force at a fairly low level of alert. And that's something that's changing, that we're trying to understand why it's changing.
That makes sense. So to put this in a little more context, we know China is also engaging in a massive conventional buildup. So can you put the nuclear posture change in context with that?
Sure. Well, one of the things is, before, when China had conventional inferiority, they potentially relied more on nuclear weapons to offset that. What's changed, at least in theater, is their 30-year investment in conventional capabilities is building a very capable conventional force. And since 1996, that's been focused on the case of Taiwan, and it's planned for US military intervention. So they've been planning and building forces to deal with that. And they made a lot of progress with much better weapon systems, strike capabilities, conventional, that can reach out and target U.S. carriers, U.S. bases, the ports that the U.S. would use in intervention over Taiwan, and then a Navy and Air Force, which historically were the weakest part of the Chinese military, now are much more capable and are a power projection tool as well. So what's really changed is the conventional balance in the area around China, including Taiwan, has shifted in China's favor. Now, where do nuclear weapons fit in that? Less need to rely on them, because China's starting to think it might be able to prevail in a conventional fight, but potentially some other applications in trying to stop the US from intervening in the first place, or if China's winning a conventional war, stop the United States from escalating to the nuclear level. So there's some different use cases or utility in China's nuclear arsenal that weren't there before, when they had a smaller, weaker conventional force.
So they can definitely serve as for sort of more coercive effects potentially. So understanding sort of how things have been in the past, and knowing that we can never fully understand their aims, are there any other hints at where they hope to go with this nuclear modernization, or what they hope to achieve? And then also, just adding on to that, do you think that China is taking any lessons from Russia's behavior right now in Ukraine?
Okay. Well, let me start by saying China hasn't explained any of this. They haven't said why they're modernizing and expanding their forces, what's the end state, has their nuclear policy changed, even though the forces they're building don't seem to be as consistent with that policy and strategy has been the case in the past. So we have to do some of our own analytic work to try to understand that. I've just completed a study with David Logan of the Naval War College, which lays out some different possible explanations. I'll very concisely go through these. One is a secure second strike. The point is to have survivable weapons after a possible US first strike and be able to deter that strike. So you need enough to survive in the face of US conventional strike and US missile defenses, which are there to clean up. And so it's a relative thing. As US capabilities improve, the kind of force that China might want probably increases, probably diversifies. But the goal is a survivable second strike. A different model is a nuclear shield, and that sees nuclear weapons as having a broader range of deterrent and coercive effects. And we ought to just mention in passing, for China, deterrence is not just about the status quo, it also implies coercion. So this would be expanding what do nuclear weapons deter? Not just nuclear threats, not just first strike, but a U.S. that might be tempted to escalate to the nuclear level if it's losing a conventional flight, and also trying to deter that intervention in the first place. And I think one thing that makes this view stand out is nuclear war is not very controllable, but it's that risk of escalation that China can now use against the U.S. And so this is taking away or eroding in some ways the U.S. assumption of nuclear superiority and escalation dominance. A third view is great power status. We find in a PLA NDU textbook in 2020 talking about the need for a nuclear force that is commensurate with China's status. So that's a status motivation, has to do both with technology and numbers. I think at a minimum, that driver takes you to a China that differentiates itself from the second tier nuclear states, your Indias, your Pakistans, your France, your UK, and makes them a clear number three. At a maximum, it takes you toward parity with the superpowers and uses that as the basis for comparison. But the logic there is a status logic, not so much a military strategy logic. And then finally, the other one that I think we need to think about is a theater deterrence model, which looks at nuclear weapons maybe more as warfighting tools, either tools that the US might use against China or tools that China can use for coercive purposes. And so this is more optimistic about the ability to control nuclear escalation. Traditional Chinese thinking is once the nuclear war starts, it's going to be very, very hard to control. And you're going to find yourself in a difficult situation. This view of theater deterrence is more optimistic about nuclear warfighting and the ability to control escalation, and tends to see a local advantage at the lower rungs of the nuclear ladder is something that can be very useful for coercive purposes. So I think those are four ways of thinking about it. I think the key point I'd make here is that latter model really focuses on operationalized capabilities at the theater level. And so that implies forces, which they're building, but it also implies supporting ISR and targeting systems, changes in doctrine, changes in training to be prepared to fight that kind of a limited nuclear conflict. Those are the things we haven't seen yet in China's nuclear force, but we need to be watching very carefully in case we do.
Thank you for laying out those four concepts so clearly. That is really helpful, just to kind of understand the different directions that we might see things going, or ways we can understand what China is doing now. So that kind of gives us a sense of Chinese nuclear policy in the past, where things might be going. So to look at the reverse side, I want to turn back to John. How would you characterize U.S. nuclear policy and doctrine and posture? Specifically, the U.S. is pursuing nuclear modernization as well, I know. So policy-wise and posture-wise, where have we been and where are we going?
Yeah, I would say that at least thus far, in a general sense, the United States hasn't made any kind of big course corrections as a result of China's nuclear buildup or the emerging two near-peer problems. So the United States has long maintained a triad of nuclear capabilities, of air, sea, and ground launch capabilities. And as you mentioned, we're in the midst of an across-the-board, just-in-time modernization program to essentially replace those capabilities. So that big push after kind of many years or decades of delay kicked off in the Obama administration, and we're in the middle of it, but there's still a long way to go. So kind of a couple things to think about is one, when we embarked on that modernization program, the threat environment that was imagined and the arms control situation that was imagined was what had existed in 2010. And as Stacie and Phil has described, there's been a lot of changes between 2010 and now. And then second is that because we're in the midst of essentially a replacement, just to maintain the capability we have, the U.S. is somewhat limited in the kind of adjustments that it can make, especially in terms of posture and capabilities. So a long way of saying there's a lot of big questions that are still emerging, but that the United States has started to think through, but is going to have to make some hard decisions going forward about the types of capabilities that are needed, and also whether or not adjustments to posture might be required. So there are a lot of them, but I'll just highlight two that I think are really going to be high level for policymakers. So first, as we've discussed, there's going to be probably in the future a greater threat of limited employment of nuclear weapons by adversaries in potential conflicts. So Russia has already issued nuclear threats in Ukraine. They're likely to be conventionally weakened after this conflict. China is developing new capabilities. As Phil described, they might have this capability to threaten theater nuclear capabilities. So if that's the future we're looking at, what does the United States need to do to strengthen deterrence of those type of threats of limited nuclear conflict? There are a lot of options out there, ranging from upgrading the posture of dual-capable aircraft to pursuing new capabilities like a nuclear-capable sea-launched cruise missile. And all of them have their pluses and minuses. So policymakers are going to have to wrestle with that and whether or not those adjustments are needed. Second, I think a big question is in terms of overall nuclear force posture, how much is enough? So for a long time, especially when the United States thought about the size of its nuclear force, it measured it against Russia. So we would have an arms control treaty with Russia. Russia was a major nuclear power. So that was really how we thought about it. But with China's buildup, there's that calculation has to change. So there's again a wide range of perspectives here about how much nuclear forces the United States needs to carry out its traditional policy. The threat is growing, but there's also the state of our industrial base and nuclear forces to consider, which limits the types of adjustments that are really required. So there are some who think that we need to be prepared for a large-scale buildup of our nuclear forces in order to account for what China is doing. And there are others who think that more modest adjustments to posture and numbers may be sufficient, at least for now, but in the future we may have to make adjustments. And again, there are a wide range of views on that, and I think that's something that policymakers need to wrestle with.
Thank you. That is really clear and helpful as well. So I think we've done a really great job of laying out a lot of context here. And it was sort of with an understanding of these very prickly problems that we set out to design at CNAS, these two tabletop exercises to better kind of understand the threat of nuclear escalation and the implications for how we can manage it. Two of the findings that we had in this report were that, before we get to our findings, I want to turn it back over to Stacie to just talk a little bit more about the games specifically. Stacie, could you tell us just what happened in the games and whether they resulted in any all-out nuclear war?
Fortunately, no all-out nuclear war, though there was some limited nuclear use, like John was saying, might be possible. I really like the four models and sort of motivations that you laid out, Phil. It's very interesting to try to understand what's driving China to make these really significant changes and invest a lot of resources in a capability that they used to think and basically Mao derided as being useless. So something's going on, and I have no idea what is actually the real reason that they're pursuing this. My guess is it is a combination of factors. We do not think that, we ran these games to explore a what if future, just try to think about what could happen because China does have these new capabilities and this expanded number of warheads. And it doesn't mean to say that we're expecting them to use them or that they're intending to use them, but being a very good realist, I know that intentions can change quickly. And Caitlin Talmadge's research on escalation risk with China in the past had showed that even during a crisis with the Soviet Union, their views towards nuclear weapons, even their limited arsenal, had shifted rather rapidly. And therefore, we just want to actually give some thought as to what China might do with these things, because they're spending so much money to build them up. And it might just be for prestige. It might simply be to have a secure second strike, because as Phil pointed out, previously they didn't. They had a very vulnerable nuclear arsenal, which in many ways could be very destabilizing. But regardless, once you have certain capabilities, oftentimes that means decision makers who are in power might want to use them or be put in a situation where they think about it. And that's really what our games were about. We only ran 2 games, very exploratory, looking at a bit of a controlled comparison, one in which we gave the red team, the more limited expected buildup of 750 nuclear weapons, and the other one over 1,000. We gave them a diverse array of different delivery systems, some of the theater weapons that Phil was talking about, in addition to the intercontinental ballistic missiles and systems that are considered more strategic, with new nuclear armed submarines, and fleshing out the air-delivered leg of their triad with the H-6N nuclear bomber, and probably the new stealth bomber that they are expected to be producing soon. And we just wanted to see what would they do if they were put in a situation in which they were told by their leadership to think about how they could employ these weapons productively to achieve their ultimate goal of forcing unification with Taiwan. And it was really a thought exercise so that we could think about some of the worst and consider when and under what conditions China might actually either brandish or consider using the nuclear capabilities that it's developing.
So just to remind our viewers, we're talking about 2 tabletop exercises that Stacie and I ran over the last year that fed into the report that this whole conversation has stemmed from. So we'll use the term games and tabletop exercises, or TTXs, all interchangeably. 2 of the outcomes that came from those TTXs that were interesting to us were that, one, the red players, or those representing China, were very willing to brandish that larger nuclear arsenal that they had coercively, and that neither the blue players representing the US nor the red players would believe the nuclear threats of their adversary in the game. So they didn't see those threats as credible. So those are 2 big issues. Turning to John, in the real world, how well do you think that the US is positioned to deal with saber rattling, like what occurred in the games? And are there any bad lessons that the US has potentially internalized from the Cold War era that you mentioned earlier, about nuclear deterrence that are or are not applicable today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that for a long time, there's been a kind of implicit assumption among many that it would be possible for the United States to fight a conventional war with China that would essentially be divorced from nuclear weapons, where nuclear weapons, essentially, we wouldn't have to worry about them. They'd be off the table. As long as we get the conventional fight right, then we're okay. But I think it's clear today, and we're seeing evidence of this in the Ukraine conflict, and will be even more so as China's capabilities expand, that the United States needs to accept that any major conflict with China, particularly one over stakes as high as Taiwan, is going to come with significant risk of escalation to nuclear war. So in some ways, this is actually a throwback to how we thought about major conflict during the Cold War, which is that whenever we contemplated the potential for a conflict, whether it was a proxy conflict, a limited conflict, or a major conflict with the Soviet Union, that potential for nuclear escalation and thinking about how we were going to avoid it or limit it was kind of a going-in problem that planners had to wrestle with. So in a future conflict with China, there's going to be a risk of inadvertent escalation. But even more so, there's going to be a risk that China, whether or not it's losing the war, or even if it's potentially winning or thinks it's winning, it may actually make a deliberate choice to employ nuclear weapons to try to favorably shape the outcome of a conflict. So like we've seen with Russia and the Ukraine conflict, China is going to have an incentive to, in certain sense, try to play up the risk of nuclear escalation to try to shape the way that the United States responds and to try to prevent us from providing kind of all-out support to Taiwan. So at least as I see it, the problem is actually less residual Cold War thinking in this respect, and it's more the residual thinking from the unipolar era of the 1990s and recent conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, where the United States didn't have to think about limiting war and avoiding nuclear escalation. And instead, our objectives were total, and we didn't have to worry about the adversary potentially responding with nuclear weapons. So it's really that shift. Kind of in some ways, we have to remember some of the old lessons and apply them to the new context that I think is needed.
So John is talking sort of about our perception of their willingness to escalate. On the flip side, I wanted to ask Phil, how do you think China understands our nuclear doctrine and resolve? And sort of as it stands now, how effective would the U.S. nuclear arsenal and posture be in deterring intra-war escalation with China?
Sure. Well, I think they see our doctrine as more aggressive and more focused on nuclear intimidation, and that the U.S. is trying to leverage its nuclear superiority into a coercive tool to use against them. So that's the starting point. But they also see an asymmetry in stakes that, and particularly over a Taiwan conflict, they see this as vitally important for them for a variety of nationalist and other reasons. And the U.S. is having a lot lower stake, and therefore being less willing to run risks and pay the price of a potential nuclear exchange. So I think they see the U.S. as inherently less committed and potentially more vulnerable to nuclear threats. So that's a difference in perspective related to the particular nature of the conflict. I know when I play games, I didn't play this particular one. Often we'll have China give some kind of a veiled nuclear threat, what Brad Roberts sometimes calls casting nuclear shadows, to try to deter U.S. intervention in the first place, or to make the Japanese worried about what might happen in a Taiwan conflict, because that's sort of a low cost kind of thing to do. But it's very different once you start actually contemplating using weapons and making threats that are more serious. You need both the capability to do that. But I think one thing from the games, as I've read in the report, is, this a little bit of nuclear threat, yes, but the real circumstances where they might be used was if one side was really losing. Mm. And these days with the conventional balance, it used to be we always thought about China losing a conventional war, and might they try to escalate their way out of it, including by threatening to use or using nuclear weapons in some ways. Today you have to think about the prospect that China might be winning a conventional war, and it's the U.S. that's faced with the choice: do we escalate or not, because the conflict's not going so well.
That's, really interesting and some scary prospects. I think one of the things that gives me the most pause is just the threat of miscalculation and inadvertent escalation. The CNAS defense team had the chance to run a game with the China Select Committee last night. That was really illuminating. And one of the things I think in that game that we were all wishing for was some kind of direct crisis communications line. But in the game, we didn't have it because right now it doesn't seem like we have it. So I want to go back to Phil and ask, where does China stand on crisis communication mechanisms, and are there any potential avenues in this situation?
Sure. Well, we have the technical capability to talk to the Chinese, both at the civilian level and at the military to military level. So we have the pipes to have secure video conferences with anybody, in the Chinese military. The issue is they don't see it usually in their interest to do so. Mm. maybe it's something so that the leaders don't have to travel to meet each other, but they've historically been very uncomfortable with the U.S. notion, oh, it's a crisis, let me call my counterpart and let's the two of us talk about it and work some way out of this mess. Partly because the way their system works, the U.S. counterpart's not empowered to make that decision or to engage substantively on it. So there's a mismatch in kind of how the systems work. That means it probably will never work the way the U.S. wants it to work, or the U.S. military is worth dealing with this. So part of that is we have to work out an understanding for what you can and can't do over these mechanisms. The Joint Staff had some conversations with the Chinese about that. It didn't get very far. We haven't had, at an official level, hardly any conversations talking about nuclear issues or the nuclear dimensions of crisis management. These have been things that have been talked about by experts in a Track 2 setting, but there's limits to how far that can go because the Chinese won't talk about specific capabilities, and sort of the ones who best know what they have and what they're thinking about generally aren't willing to talk about it in those kinds of settings. So it's, again, I guess the bottom line here is it's not an issue not having, a phone line that will work to have secure conversations. It's just the Chinese system works differently, and they don't envision using crisis communications in this way. This is sort of one of a broader stream of things that we might think about broadly under arms control and confidence building measures. I have to confess I'm pessimistic about prospects for any formal arms control, partly because the relations are so bad, partly we have very different expectations. China sees this as a way of solidifying good relations. The US sees it as a way of managing relations with an enemy. The force imbalances that we have make it hard. US concerns about China-Russia strategic cooperation. And that's a problem right there because China is not going to accept a binding limit less than the US has, which means the US is going to be confronting a China and Russia that are bigger than the US. So I think there's a lot of challenges with the formal arms control agenda. Where there's maybe some prospect for success is a little bit more transparency, because China's nuclear force is going to be less vulnerable than it was in the past. So maybe they can be more transparent. Continuing to work this crisis communication mechanism, but perhaps with more realistic, less ambitious directions. We're going to pick up the phone. We're going to communicate information to you. We don't expect you to respond, but just pass it on to your leadership and think what to do. The other change that I wanted to highlight was sort of changes in Chinese operational practice. They used to have a nuclear force that the warheads and the delivery systems were demated, and they weren't really on alert. They were stored to be safe in caves or silos. Now they're moving to a force that's regularly on alert and maybe moving toward a launch on warning status. So their operational practices are moving in a direction that in some ways is a lot more dangerous. I think that's a topic that we could talk about. Is that really where you want to go? Or if you want to go there, shouldn't it be only a very small part of your force? And think about what are the implications of changes in doctrine and operational practices for strategic stability. I think you can have those conversations, and it would be useful for both sides to do so. And then two other specific points, maybe an agreement on pre-launch notification. The Chinese have that agreement with the Russians, and they do share that information. The other thing that's changing is China's now put up a launch detection satellite constellation that can take a look at whether the US has launched on them. And as they get used to having that, they may follow the Soviet model. That's a really useful thing. We want to have that in a crisis. Maybe we need to agree to take that off the list if we're thinking about space warfare. So perhaps there's scope for some agreements to not mess with those launch detection satellites or mess with nuclear command and control. So there's a couple areas where I'm modestly less pessimistic and have a small degree of optimism about what might be possible.
That does provide a shred of hope. there are things that we can do now, but it will take work on both sides. I wanted to throw it to Stacie. Stacie was our game master for the game we did on the Hill last night. Did you have anything you wanted to add on the crisis communications or anything else Phil talked about?
There's a lot there. I actually wanted to go back to John's point first and about sort of the Cold War mindset and assuming that we can have absolute goals and use conventional force and not have to worry about escalation, which I think is totally true. And that with respect to the Soviet Union and now Russia, US policymakers have been sensitized by decades of experience and research to take seriously Russian nuclear threats because their doctrine follows it. You know, they have the force structure, and they have all of the sort of trappings of operationalizing it and being potentially willing to use it. And that doesn't exist for China. China's still developing its policy and its doctrine, like Phil laid out. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take seriously that it has those capabilities, and we need to, be mindful of that in the event of a crisis or, heaven forbid, a conflict with China, because we don't want any sort of inadvertent escalation. The US also has to worry about its own nuclear threats being credible. And this is incredibly important in Northeast Asia in particular, where US allies rely on the American nuclear umbrella for their security. South Korea does and is looking at mainly North Korea, but a little bit worried about its neighbor to the west. Japan definitely has concerns across the board. And if they don't believe that the US extended nuclear deterrent is sound, then they might be pursuing their own options to potentially develop weapons. On crisis communications, I think that we should wholeheartedly try to find ways to establish them. You can think back to the balloon crisis of several months ago, I guess now, and the fact that the Chinese wouldn't pick up the phone and talk to General Milley or and sort of just discuss the situation. I like Phil's idea of the fact that we need to break from the way that what we did with the Soviets and now the Russians, that maybe the Chinese aren't going to do the exact same thing, but we can still find different ways of communicating. We just have to come up with different accepted norms by both of us that work and achieve the ultimate objective of making sure that we have some open lines of communication, even if they aren't entirely parallel to what we've done in the past and with other countries.
That's great. Thank you. So looking back to the games that we ran several months ago, another few findings from the report that we had were just about the stark asymmetry of targets that were available to the US versus to the PRC. And then also just the danger of triggering nuclear escalation, even while attempting to only target selectively conventional capabilities. So Stacie, these asymmetric target sets make managing escalation really tricky. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I will take a first stab, and then I would suggest John jumps in because he really has grappled with this issue as well in the games. What we mean by asymmetric target sets is that the United States has military bases on Allied territory. It has military bases on non-contiguous US territory. It has military bases on US states like Hawaii and Alaska. And then it has surface naval vessels that are sailing in East Asia at any moment in time, in addition to the continental United States. And so there are different target sets that China could go after should it want to hit the United States that would allow it to potentially control escalation more easily. When the US, in contrast, looks towards China and thinks about trying to stop an invasion of Taiwan, first, most obvious target and should be a priority is stopping an invasion fleet, taking out an airborne drop or an air assault. But after that, you quickly, you only have a few other options, like the features in the South China Sea that the PLA has some bases on. But then you're sort of left to mainland China in terms of the targets that you want to hit to degrade Chinese capabilities on the conventional side. And that could potentially cross some sort of red line. Nations typically don't look kindly upon their country being bombed, and that could lead to escalation, even if it were just an attempt to degrade China's conventional capabilities that are supporting an invasion force. And so that asymmetry is potentially disadvantages the US in terms of giving it ways to manage escalation and sometimes manipulate risk. John, do you have anything you want to jump in there on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think you summarized it well. The underlying issue is that if there's again, we want to deter or prevent there from being a conflict with China over Taiwan. But if there is an actual conflict, both sides, because of the large nuclear arsenals on both sides, but also for other reasons, are going to want to try to keep the conflict limited. So there's essentially going to be a competition between both sides where they're going to try to achieve their objectives and use the military force required while trying to kind of cap the conflict or limit escalation. And so one of the things that both sides are going to do is to try to get the others to accept some sort of rules, implicit rules, or tacit limitations on how they're going to fight. So for the US, for example, we would very much like to be able to defend Taiwan while deterring escalation to nuclear employment. We would want China to not be able to conquer Taiwan while avoiding nuclear employment. But if China has a vote and decides to actually use nuclear weapons, then that would be something that we would have to deal with. And then even after that situation where China has used nuclear weapons to try to achieve their objectives, we would still be trying to find a way to kind of achieve our objectives while limiting escalation to large-scale nuclear use. And this is, I think, what Stacie was alluding to in terms of thinking about those kind of escalation management, is that one of the things that the United States is going to want to avoid, for example, is that they're going to want to avoid China conducting large-scale nuclear strikes against U.S. territory. The challenge, though, is that if China conducts a nuclear strike, let's say against an ally, the United States wants to respond, have an effective military response, demonstrate that we're not going to back down, but also avoid kind of setting off a tit-for-tat escalation that's going to result in large-scale strikes on the U.S. territory. So in that sense, then maybe we might want to avoid a nuclear strike on Chinese territory. Then, though, as Stacie alluded to, if that's off the table or if you're trying to avoid that, then what is left to strike at? And this was sort of an example of a dilemma in this kind of very dark scenario that we were presented in the TTX, where China had already conducted a nuclear strike, and we were trying to wrestle with how do we manage escalation, and that got to some of these asymmetries that you and Stacie highlighted.
So to get a little bit more into that specific example, John was a participant on the blue side in one of our games, and in the instance he's talking about, the U.S. had conducted those strikes on the Chinese mainland and tried to differentiate, but China didn't fully appreciate the efforts to make that distinction. And after repeated calls to cease the strikes, Red conducted a limited nuclear strike on Guam. And after a lot of deliberation, the blue team responded by conducting an asymmetric conventional attack on the PLA nuclear force by sinking 2 nuclear-armed submarines that they were tracking. So I want to go back to John again real quick and ask, why did Blue decide to strike those submarines? Were you satisfied with the options available to you? What additional nuclear capabilities have helped?
So I think I kind of talked through some of the dilemmas that we were facing in terms of trying to balance between kind of having a decisive military effect, persuading China not to conduct additional nuclear strikes, but also trying to limit escalation. So in the instance of the TTX, there were kind of a couple factors that were important to the way that we thought through the answer. First was that at least our assessment on the blue team was that we were winning. So we thought that kind of if the conflict it continued along in a conventional sense, that we would be able to effectively defend Taiwan. So we saw China's nuclear strike as more of an act of desperation or coercion to try to get us to back down, as opposed to something kind of a different situation where the U.S. was losing the conflict. And second is that as a result, we were kind of comfortable with kind of responding in a way that would demonstrate that we weren't going to back down. We weren't going to allow them to use nuclear risk to get us to withhold support, but we didn't think that it was needed to kind of conduct a large-scale nuclear strike in response that might come with further risk of escalation. Was that the right answer? Who knows? It was just a game, and it would a lot depend on the circumstances. But I think it's an example of the types of factors that are going to be at play, and the challenge of wrestling with that balance between kind of managing escalation while also kind of manipulating risk in your favor to achieve the objectives you want if we're in one of these dire situations.
That's great. Thank you. And it's really nice to have your experience here as with all of your knowledge, but also your experience from the game. I want to bring in one of our audience questions from Zhao Shan, and I'll direct this towards Phil. Can you assess Taiwan's shortcomings in air defenses, discuss where PLA's biggest advantages lie, and give some advice about how the U.S. can better help Taiwan thwart Chinese military air superiority in a conflict?
This is going to be a huge problem for China for Taiwan rather, because their airfields and radars are all within range of Chinese land-based missiles. And I think generally, we just did a book, Crossing the Strait, that looks in some detail about what a PRC capabilities for a Taiwan conflict. But I think the general assessment is Taiwan's Air Force is going to be out of the fight pretty quickly because the airfields are going to be gone. And if the Air Force, as soon as they hit the sky, they're within range of Chinese surface-to-air missiles based on the mainland with that kind of range. So air defense is a huge problem for Taiwan. The Air Force is probably not the way that they're going to do it because it's not going to last long in a conflict. What you're left with are mobile surface-to-air missiles of various kinds. You move them around so the Chinese can't target them. And what you do with a surface-to-air missile, it's not always that you're shooting down the adversary plane, but you're forcing them to operate from further away or from a higher altitude where they can't be as effective. So I think that's what Taiwan has to look to is mobile systems, man-portable air defense systems, things that are hard for the PRC to strike, but don't allow it to bring its Air Force fully to bear in a conflict.
Thank you. That's helpful. And thank you, Zhao Shan, for the audience question. I want to get at something we talked about, or we hinted at a little earlier, just sort of entanglement as a challenge. A lot of Chinese conventional capabilities are entangled with their nuclear capabilities, with just dual use systems. Phil, can you talk a little about the challenge that presents?
Sure. I mean, it's a challenge because China's conventional and nuclear command and control systems seem to be fairly entangled for the rocket forces. And so if you're going after one, you might inadvertently hit another. It's a challenge because some of their new missiles, like the DF-26, are dual capable. It might have a nuclear warhead. It might have a conventional warhead. You don't really know. And so if you're taking conventional shots from DF-26s and you go after those missiles and the bases that are commanding them, that may accidentally have an impact on China's nuclear arsenal, and they might think that it is part of an effort to start to eat away at their nuclear capabilities. Now, paradoxically, this is the silver lining of China's nuclear expansion. When they have a larger nuclear force, and if a lot of it is silo-based and the U.S. is not attacking those forces, they can be pretty sure this is not part of a U.S. nuclear first strike. And they may have to tolerate a little bit of losses and things that do affect their nuclear capability, at least at that MRBM, IRBM level, kind of your medium and intermediate range missiles. If their strategic nuclear arsenal, their ICBMs, are not affected by that, then it may be less dangerous than we think. So that is a small silver lining in a larger nuclear force. But I think part of the rationale for dialogue with the Chinese is to make that point to them, that this is a consequence. They're in a different place than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And also make the point, you can't expect to be shooting conventional missiles at Guam, at US bases in Japan, at ports in Japan, and not expect the US to shoot back. And that kind of conventional retaliation, I just think is going to be part of any real conflict. If the US doesn't do that, it's going to be very handicapped in a conventional conflict. And the conventional fight is a little bit different from the nuclear one that John was talking about, and Stacie was talking about, where these asymmetries and target sets really, really come to the fore.
Okay, I am going to throw in another question from the audience, from Graham, and I'll direct this towards John. How does the improvement of the PRC's conventional capability change the standard dynamics between a rising power and a status quo power? And I'll throw my own spin on it. We've talked mostly about China today. It's the pacing challenge and the focus of our report, but we started today talking about the multipolar nuclear age. So balancing everything that entails. Over to you, John.
Sure. I mean, I think both Phil and Stacie have already got to some of this, in that, Phil talked about how, in the past, when China it was kind of assumed that the U.S. would be able to win any conventional conflict over Taiwan. We were more concerned about them using nuclear weapons when they were losing. And now there's at least kind of doubt or more doubt in the future about how that conflict would go. So that kind of changes the dynamics about what a conflict might look like, but also the role that nuclear weapons might play on both sides. So that in terms of what the scenarios are for employment, but also the possibilities for escalation. But to get to your last point, I think the other part, and we talked about this beginning, is the Russia-China dynamic. The relationship is clearly getting closer, and there's outward demonstrations of that. It's by no means an alliance on par with how the U.S. has alliances, but it's definitely a closer relationship. So one of the hard things that U.S. policymakers have to think through is, what could that dynamic look like in a future conflict? How might they, whether opportunistically take advantage of a future conflict, or provide either in kind or direct, military, political, or economic support to the other in a conflict in a way to try to disrupt the United States? And that applies obviously at the conventional level, but it also applies at the nuclear level. Could one try to manipulate nuclear risk, even if they're not a direct party to the conflict, by, for example, alerting nuclear forces in a way that could cause problems or issues for the United States? And that's just one of many examples of this kind of three-party dynamic, and how that could affect conflict scenarios that the U.S. policymakers are starting to wrestle with, but really need to even more so as this trajectory of China's conventional and nuclear forces buildup continues.
Great, thank you. So I'll close up really quickly with one last question to Stacie. One of the overarching recommendations from our report was the need for thinking about these issues just a lot more. There's a lot more work to be done. So Stacie, can you tell us where the research is headed?
Yes, absolutely. And I think John's point about sort of the intersection and the degree of support that Russia and China are giving each other is an important one. If you've seen the New York Times story from the last week about Russia supporting plutonium enrichment in China, that is one potential example of that is concerning. But where we're going specifically is focusing on China, and it is with the newest member of our defense team at CNAS, Andrew Metric, who is focused on considering what would happen if a U.S. and China war became protracted. Neither side could quickly win, which is increasingly the direction and the conclusion that people are reaching in our war games and analysis and other war games that people are running. And considering what the escalation risks are in a protracted war scenario, as Phil and John have both mentioned, the impetus and the need to use nuclear weapons early on is probably pretty low if China believes that it has confidence in its conventional forces. And it's when you find that states are backed against the wall and they fear losing that they might, be more likely to reach for this sort of draconian option. So it's something that we want to explore. There could be other reasons too, I know Andrew has some thoughts about potentially using nuclear weapons as a form of conflict termination, akin to what some people have argued Russia might do as well. So there are a lot of things that I think merit a lot more explanation or exploration by this entire community, and hopefully there will be a lot of good work being done going forward.
I think we can all agree on that. And with that, I'm going to conclude this event. Big thank you to our panelists. It was so cool to hear from you guys, and I definitely learned a lot, took a lot of notes. And thank you to our guests. We will see you again next time.
Thanks so much.